issue of conflict between the police departments and black communities. And my first question for you is this happening more frequently, or is this just something that with the use of cell phones and technology we're just seeing more of? Can you give us some insight into this?
Yes, absolutely. It's the latter. When we in the Malcolm X grassroots movement started our Cop Watch program back in the 90s, we were seeing and hearing of all these types of incidents, from Anthony Baez being choked to death, very similar to what happened to Eric Garner, from Amadou Diallo being shot unarmed, very similar to what we have seen recently. But the difference is now is that we have all this video footage, and we're able to have a conversation in social media and push these stories out in a way that we couldn't in the 90s, or in the 80s or the 70s or the 60s for that matter. And so we're seeing a growth of awareness, and there's more tools that people have to discuss these incidents.
And what's interesting is that one of the things we're finding is that the racial disparities persist even under regimes or administrations that are actually attempting police reform. If you look, for example, at what's happening with stop and frisk here in New York, which has actually been in the news a lot lately as a result of it coming up in some of the most recent the presidential debate. But even if we look at stop and frisk, an area that has been under some level of policing reform, we know that at its height in 2011, over 600,000 New Yorkers were stopped by the police. And I like to always add 80% of those were completely innocent at the time they were being stopped. But of that 600,000+ people, 54% of the people who stopped were African American, 30+% were Latino. You fast forward to the year 2015, and we see stops drop off precipitously from over 600,000 to under 25,000 stops. And yet, within that 25,000 stops, 54% of the people who stopped were Black, 30+% were Latino. So we're looking at, regardless of what type of regime we're operating under, African descendant people are still bearing the brunt of racism within the confines of policing. And so, Jason, one of the things we often like to do is look at a Sankofa analysis, really that principle from West Africa that says you have to look to your past in order to understand your present so that you can build adequately for the future. In light of that history, can you explain a bit how the history of racism in this society impacts what we see happening between police and Black communities today?
Absolutely, and thank you guys for continuing this conversation. It's unfortunate that we're talking about it under these circumstances, but I appreciate the fact that the dialogue is happening. So thank you for that. I think one of the things that people need to understand is that the criminal justice system in this country is really inextricably connected to the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow in the United States, and this is not an accident. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, also includes a gaping loophole that says that involuntary servitude and slavery is illegal except as punishment for a crime. And so the folks who were on the short end of the stick when slavery was abolished and suffered all sorts of economic and social losses, took full advantage of that loophole and enacted laws that were designed specifically to criminalize Black people and particularly Black men. And so you had laws like vagrancy and disorderly conduct, loitering, these sorts of things, laws that are still on the books today that allowed police officers to arrest and imprison Black men who were then used or basically leased to the highest bidder to provide the same sort of free labor that they were providing under slavery.
Now, I just want to pause there for just a minute because I think that is a huge part of the conversation that we don't often get to dive into. So when you have this 13th Amendment, which says no slavery except if you're convicted of a crime, after the passage of the 13th Amendment, you have the introduction of these new rules and regulations called the Black Codes. Black codes which were modeled on the slave codes, and the slave codes were those rules that determined how Black and white people would interact with each other. What level of volume could you speak at? How frivolous could your conversation be in the presence of white people? How nervous could you make white people with the way you gesture and hold your body? And so with those being those new rules that we see coming into play after the Emancipation Proclamation, how does that connect to what we now understand to be convict leasing?
Well, I think there's still a level of misunderstanding and apprehension with respect to Black people, Black men, and so on. And so, we're living right now in what is starting to approach a police state, particularly in certain areas of certain cities in urban America. And so, I don't think that, I think that this is a continuum, and if you don't understand where we started, then there's no way that we can figure out how to get out of this hole that we're in. And as I said, the fact that we're having a dialogue about this and hopefully, forcing people to think about things that are uncomfortable to think about, that will lead to progress. That's the goal.
I wanted to just add briefly too, even before the Civil War, the origins of policing were rooted in preserving white supremacy. Some of the first police forces that you saw in the Americas in New England was the Indian Constable. So it was specifically to police Indian communities that were situated around the settlers. In St. Louis, which was like the New Western Front, same thing. Those constables were specifically, their main charge was to patrol Native Americans who were in the vicinity of these Western settlers. And then in the South, their main job as police forces, the patty rollers, was to maintain and enforce slavery, to catch runaway slaves, to control black and brown bodies, and to preserve white supremacy. So your first police forces had that as their main charge. And so if you don't understand that,
Right.
then you don't understand what's going on now.
Right.
One of my heroes, the Honorable Marcus Garvey, he has a quote. He says that people without knowledge of their history are like trees with no roots. So I think this is really important to talk about, because in a lot of these conversations, people don't know that history. So they think that it's something new, and you have to be intentional about breaking the cycle. If you want to break that cycle, there is a book that I want to reference. It's called Slavery by Another Name, and it's by a scholar named Douglas Blackman. And it really deals with how blacks were re-enslaved after the Civil War all the way through World War II as a result of convict leasing and all of these deals that were made with slave owners. And he argues that the neo-slavery, what he calls neo-slavery, was actually in many ways worse than slavery. During slavery, you had an interest in keeping your slaves alive and clothing them, and remnants of the family staying together. But now that you can criminalize people anytime you want, you started to see the life expectancy was lower. The conditions, a lot of those that were re-enslaved, the re-enslaved are not having, are not healthy. And he argues that it's actually worse. So I think that kind of brings us to our next